Is everything we've been taught about sports nutrition wrong? It depends what sport or activity you're dealing with. Growing up, we're told eat more carbs, eat more carbs, eat more carbs. Oatmeal this, wheat bread that, Powerade, Gatorade, sugary sports drinks, processed foods. They help you perform, right? Maybe, but what's it doing to us long term? And could there be something we're missing? And it's not just from an athletic perspective. This is for the everyday person too. Today I sit down with ultra-running legend Jeff Browning and we talk all things nutrition, both for performance and longevity and general health. Jeff dives deep into what OFM is, or oxidative fat metabolism, and how we can all turn our bodies into fat-burning machines so that we're not so reliant on carbohydrates, and so we can really tap into those fat stores that we have, use fat as fuel, become more fat adapted, which is going to help us perform better, recover faster, and be at optimal health and performance for the long run. Jeff has so much knowledge and information to share. With over 20 years in the endurance space, he now coaches hundreds of athletes, both to become the best runners possible and also include diet, nutrition, to help them optimize their health and their lifestyles. By the end of this episode, you're going to learn more about oxidative fat metabolism, or OFM, how to apply that to your life to improve your health, performance, and overall quality of life. If you find value in this conversation, do me a favor, give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who'd find value in it. Now it's time to dive into it with Jeff Browning. Before we even get going on this conversation, please elaborate. Like, your name is Jeff Browning. How does Bronco Billy, like, where does that come from?
Um, my well, I started climbing when in the late '90s when I moved to Denver after college, and one of my friends from Wyoming that was belonged to our climbing gym. Um, he had the habit of yelling "giddy up" in a lot of situations, and obviously being a farm boy and from Missouri, I immediately latched on to giddy up with him, and we would use it all the time when we were on climbing trips. We did a lot of climbing trips. We were kind of pioneered the 10 Sleep Climbing Festival in Wyoming. We were there the first 2 years. We created it. Was a bunch of group of us from Denver that came up. And anyway, his name's Aaron Huey, and Aaron kind of was using this word giddy up, and I latched on to the word giddy up, and I used it constantly. And then I moved on away from Denver. He moved too, and I continued to kind of just use it. We use it in all circumstances. Like, if you're like trying to make a move on a climbing route, you'd be like, giddy up, man, when someone's like pausing and not sure they're going to make it. Uh, um, and so we just use it a lot. And I continue to use it regularly as part of my vocabulary, you know, and I befriended a guy who was like kind of taking me under his wing when I first got into ultra running in 2001, 2002. And I paced him at Wasatch in '03, and he claimed to be from the Berserker tribe, direct descendant, being a Viking. And so I called him Berserker. I coined him his nickname Berserker. And because I was yelling giddy up all the time, I don't know where he came up with it, but he coined me Bronco Billy. And so we would jokingly, when we were doing adventures, and we did a lot of training together in that time. His name is Jason Moyer. He still lives in Bend, Oregon. And he would just say, he's like, "Come on, Bronco Billy," and like I would be like, "Get your battle axe, Berserker," and and it was just all a good fun. But in 2004, 2003, 2004, around that same time, I was a graphic designer and kind of into branding and marketing, and I was kind of started doing a blog, just to show my family in the Midwest, like what I was doing and these 100 milers I was running and ultras and what they were. And so I was doing race reports on a blog. And I started out with a blogger, just the old blogger blogs. And then I decided, like, well, I was doing it regularly enough that I was like, well, I'm going to get a domain name. And so I started looking for like jeffbrowning.com. I'd just gotten sponsored on the Montreal Patagonia team. So I was trying to promote myself as an athlete. And so I was looking for Jeff Browning. It wasn't available, jeffbrowning.com. That's back before there was all the .net and everything else. There was just .coms. And so I was looking for Bronco Billy, wasn't available. And then I was like, well, I want an action word, maybe go Bronco Billy. I started with run Bronco Billy. I was like, what if I get injured and I have to ride my bike the rest of my life? So I was like, well, I'll just come up with an action word. So that's where go Bronco Billy came from, with all my social handles. And so I started a URL, gobroncobilly.com, and kept doing blog. And it was basically just a blog. And then that's how it started. And then everyone just, after a while, blogs got really popular. Who knew? I just did it to do, to show my family, but then I had people like commenting and reading it, and before they do the same race, and it kind of became, and I jokingly used to use Bronco Billy as an alter ego in the story, when I was doing my blog posts, like, you don't let him out of the stable until the second half of the race because he likes to go hard, and stuff like that. So I was doing, jokingly using it for entertainment. But it kind of became that for me, racing hundreds too. And around that same time I was doing a blog, I ran my first 100 miler in 2005 and Bighorn 100. And so it got popular. And so then I started being at races, and I'd hear people like not even using my real name. They'd be like, "Go Bronco," and then I had a bunch of people tell me that, or a bunch of people in the sport, like Joe Grant, Rock Horton, and Chrissy Mail, and a whole bunch of kind of early kind of pioneers in the 2000s in the space. Wouldn't even call me Jeff anymore. They just called me Bronco. Everyone's just started calling me Bronco all the time. So it kind of took on a life of its own. And then it's now what it is today. And half of my athletes even just call me Bronco, that I coach. So it's really stuck. So that's kind of the background.
I love it. I love it. I'm curious, man, where does the boom for ultra running really begin too? Because I mean, you see it over the past couple of years, and I mean, I've only really been in the running space for the past year or so, and the more and more like I talk to people like you and Zach Bitter and Mike McKnight and other people in the space, it's really like seemed like it's taken a boom over the past couple of years. But like you said, you ran your first 100 in 2005, so you've been doing it for a while. Like, where the sport of ultra, when did it really start to gain popularity? And then I'll add like a second question to that is like, why do you think it's caught so much fire over the past, however many years?
Well, I mean, when I got into the sport in 2001, it was growing. So there was a bell curve growth, and it really hasn't stopped. Um, so it was just starting. There was a couple documentaries came out around the late 90s and early 2000s. One on Western States. That's how I found out about Western States 100, was through a North Face documentary. And then so there's a little bit of documentaries being passed around on VHS back then, because that was before there was streaming or any kind of like on-demand stuff. So you didn't have YouTube or anything like that. You didn't have anything way to access those videos except unless someone said, "Hey man, have you seen this, documentary? And let me put it in the VCR." So I think it's kind of started in the early 2000s, and it grew, but it really took off, I would say, after some of the documentaries came out in like 2010, 2011. Like, there's one on Western States. It was the year Jeff Rose won Western States, and that's when Killian was there for the first time and got third, and Tony Kaprichka was like in second, and it was a really cool shakeup race. I think that's when we really started to see like there start to be more people. It became more like, oh, I've heard of ultras, right? The average person may have heard of what an ultra marathon, right? And so I think that's where we really started, and we really started to see the competitive growth from like 14, 15 on, like where like times are coming way down in some of these races. And I think part of that's just the learning curve of how to train for these things because they're new. And I think the other thing that's why it's popular, so part two of your question, I think is you're on trails. The community's really mellow and laid back and super accepting. So it's one of those things like compared to say a marathon or a triathlon or even like, basketball game, football game, right? You never get access to those elite athletes, right? They're like over here and they get swept away and they get their own bullpen and they get their own warm-up area, and you never really get to like rub elbows with them. And one of the things that attracted me to the sport in the early days, and it's still this way today, is that you have access to the top of the tier. So what's cool is you can finish a 100 miler, and the guy who won or girl. Sometimes girls win overall, like at Tahoe 200 that just happened. And sometimes, that they're sitting at the finish line having a beer with the guy who came in last. And I think that's one of the cool things, aspects of our sport. What other sport where you can like, you could be like hanging out and talking to one of the best runners in the world. For example, at Hard Rock, like Courtney Dauwalter is obviously arguably the best woman in ultra running history at this point. And and you can be just hanging out and talking to her and having a beer, so like it's just really a cool aspect of the sport. Plus I think people need more time with nature, and trail running speaks to that.
That is a really great point. There's something different about marathons versus ultra marathons. I ran 2 marathons, and I've done 2 marathons, and I've done 1 ultra. I did Quest for the Crest 50K in North Carolina, which was brutal. It was like 23,000 feet of elevation. It was gnarly, but it was an amazing entrance into the scene of ultra. But it was so different, like the environment, the types of people. Like the night before, the packet pickup, people are hanging out, they're eating barbecue, like some people are drinking beers, they're about to go out and run the next day. And then I'm out on the trail the next day, and I see the same people who are pounding PBRs or like smoking me on the trail. I'm like, damn, this is such a completely different ball game. But it was interesting talking to so many people at the venue, and even like just throughout the race. I don't think I talked to anybody who was like, yeah, like I do marathons, like, and I do ultras, or like I did marathons and now I got into ultras. It was like most of people were like, yeah, I've never ran a marathon, but I run hundreds and I do these 50Ks and I do these crazy ultra marathons. So why do you think that some people just like skip marathons altogether and just go straight to the ultras?
I you know I think one of the things is that ultra marathon runners are little evangelists for the sport. you know
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
so into it because it becomes a lifestyle. you know um if I look at the early days, like, I at some point my graphic design career, like I quit and I became a full-time coach and athlete. And so like the I just followed a passion through all those years. I was like, getting up early in the morning when I had little kids, and I was running at 11 o'clock at night with a headlamp on, and I was trying to get my training in wherever I could. But I loved the sport and the community so much that I just knew I wanted to be a part of it. I didn't care. There was no major goal like, oh, I want to be this elite athlete, or I want to be like at this tiered sponsored. It was just like, oh, cool. They're going to send me some free shoes. Sweet. I'm in, like that's just a perk. Like for me, I'd do it even if I had to pay for them. So like it doesn't matter to me. And I came to the sport from like a cycling background. So first 3 years in the sport, I wasn't super fast or anything. I wasn't trying to race them. I was just trying to figure them out and race and hang out, and I enjoyed the training. I enjoyed running on trails. I lived in Bend, Oregon at the time. So I had access right out my door to trails. And so, I've always picked location over career. And we've always lived in a mountain town. After Denver, we decided, 3 years in Denver, sitting in rush hour traffic when in the 90s, and it's way worse now, the Front Range. But like, I was just like, I didn't want to do this. My wife and I decided that we would move to a smaller town. So we moved to a town of, 40,000 at the time. And it grew a lot while we were there, but it was only, it was a small town. And we decided, you know what, we're just going to move to a mountain town and we'll make it work and we'll figure it out. And that's what we've been doing ever since. And I think that's what attracts people to the sport is it's so laid back. And yeah, go do a training block for a marathon and then go do a training block for an ultra marathon. The training's way cooler.
Way cooler. Was I jumped right in I ran like a marathon and then an ultra within a month, and so I really only had like a month of like true like ultra prep before I ran it. But I was like, "Oh, this is great. Like I'm getting out there and I'm doing 6 or 7 miles. It's taking me a lot longer than it would do on the road, but I don't feel as beat up. I'm in nature. Like I'm just I feel it's more primal. It just feels a lot more
It really
natural
is.
than just
Well,
pounding
it's
through
because you're
cement.
tapping into something that we as humans are supposed to be. We're supposed to be in nature. We're supposed to be
Right.
in nature every day. And that's what's cool about the training, right? You get your like, it's almost like a reset every day when you go train, especially if you live in a location like Austin where you have, trails out, and I live in Flagstaff, trails right out my back door. It is really not hard. Like I can be on dirt in 3/4 mile from my house. I run out my neighborhood through a park and I'm on trails. So like it's really sweet for me having that kind of, not everyone has that. If you live in New York City, you might have Central Park and that's it. Right. But you still have nature. And as trail runners, we start, once you start running ultras, you start to identify as a trail runner, right? Like that's one of the things trail runners really identify as trail runners, man. We're like looking for dirt everywhere we can, something not, something that's natural and not man-made. So even like, I have athletes, and one of the things we talk about is like, okay, you live in a concrete jungle. Well, let's run when you're running, let's train, like look for, challenge. Here's a challenge. If you live in a concrete jungle, try to go for a run and be on the least amount of man-made surface you can. Meaning, that little space between like a sidewalk and the street, like run on that, right? Weave in and out of trees, jump off the curb. Maybe you have to cross the street to the other side to pick it up on the other side. Business parks are amazing because you get this nice little single track of grass that's perfectly manicured that no one ever uses, and you get to go use it like single track in the middle of town, right? Or cutting through a park, right? You instead of like just following concrete everywhere and pavement, you go, oh man, I'm going to cut across there, and so you start to look at things different, even in an urban setting. You start to look at your training ground differently if you're a trail runner.
What do you think is the biggest difference between training for a regular marathon and training for an ultra marathon?
I think,
And how to improve at them?
well, I think the biggest thing is you're so focused on pace when you're training for road races, right? And trail running, it's more the experience, because for most of the pack, most of the people in the race are middle to the back of the pack, right? They're not the three guys up front racing for the podium or the three girls, right? It's just a bunch of us just out there enjoying it and running that course. So, you can run a 50K, the marathon, you can run 5 marathon courses and your time's going to be within a minute, right? But if you go run an ultra marathon, you could run 5 50Ks and your time could be hours different depending on the difficulty, technicality, so you learn to embrace the space you're in, and you say, you know what, it's me against this course. And we tend to, like, it becomes more of a social like experience than it is like, oh my gosh, I got a PR, and it makes everything just way more laid back. And I think it makes it, for the long haul, it makes training for them more a lifestyle approach than this like ego approach.
For you, what have been the biggest things that have allowed you to continue to improve, to continue to build your engine, and just continue to get better in the sport of ultra as you've continued to get into your 50s?
I think the number one's consistency. I mean, consistency trumps everything, right? When it comes to like endurance training. So, even aerobic volume, consistent aerobic volume year round for me. And I go into periodization phases, like I might, run less in the, like for 4 to 6 weeks in the winter, and ski a little more. And I might be on my bike, or I might be in the gym more, lifting weights. I do think weight training and mobility is a really important thing for longevity. I had some injuries in the first 3 or 4 years in the sport, and I really started to adopt a very um, consistent strength training program. I'd always strength trained, being from a football background, and focused on football in high school. When I was about 13 or 14, I started lifting in a weight room. Our gym in the 80s, my coach was an early adopter of like a free weight gym. He converted a basement wrestling room into a free weight gym in our junior high locker room. So you had to go through the boys' locker room to get into this space to lift weights at that time, because he was the PE teacher, and he had boys PE, and and then we had a girls PE teacher. So it was totally like, segregated back in the 80s. And so the boys, he was the PE teacher for junior high and high school, and he was the head football coach. And our assistant football coach went to Nebraska. And so he knew all the Nebraska staff. And so in the 80s, University of Nebraska football team had the kind of premier strength training program that everyone kind of followed in their footsteps, but they were the pioneers in like the early 80s and mid 80s. And so coming off of that pioneering, they had a full program, and we had access to the Nebraska strength training program from like 8th grade on. So I kind of hit at this kind of pivotal spot in the history of strength training in high schools, where my coaches were early adopters and got us started. And our coach was so into it that he made us, if we were going to play on Friday nights, you had to go out for PE every semester. And we worked out on the Nebraska strength training program 4 days a week. And then we did something on Fridays, like, volleyball or handball or something, like an elective sport that we kind of played on that day that he decided. But the other 4 days, we were in the weight room at PE. So you lifted 4 days a week all year round. And then he opened up the gym every day in the summer, and you had to come in at least 25 times or 27. He had some weird number. It might have been a 27. He's like, you got to be 27 times, and you got to check it off for the whole summer before summer camp, before August football summer camp. So like, I got in a lifestyle habit. By the time I was a senior, I'd been lifting for 5 years, 4 days a week. And so I went into college with that habit and continued to lift. I lifted all through college. I continued to lift in my 20s, on and off, but I got really bad in my late 20s. I was chasing a career. I was mountain biking, and I wasn't really lifting that much, and I couldn't afford to own a gym membership in my early career. And so the strength training really took off in my late 30s, or in my mid to late 30s, when I was having some injuries, and I got into ultras in my late 20s and right around 30. By 33 or 34, I started strength training regularly to deal with some muscle imbalances from cycling that really fixed me. And then I quit getting injured. And then all of a sudden I'm consistent for years and years and years and years without any setbacks. And that's where that aerobic volume comes into play in performance and longevity. And strength training keeps your muscle mass and keeps you mobile, because you're working on a full range of motion, and all those kind of things.
I want to circle back a little bit to we'll get into what you're doing now for strength training, but I'm curious, what did that program look like, the strength training program from Nebraska?
So it was like bench press, incline, dips, squat rack, hip sled. And we did upper body and lower body alternating days. So you did 2 days upper body, 2 days of lower body. And we focused on that, and we went through stations in PE, and we got a program. We had clipboards and charts and paper printed out, and you had to fill it out with a pencil. And we would mark down what we did. So we would start out, if I remember this right, we worked towards like higher reps. It was a 6 weeks. It was a 6-week program, and then you did a 1 rep max and everything, and then you got your new numbers. So you were shooting for specific weights. Nebraska had it all charted out. So if you maxed at this weight, this is what you're doing 12, 10, 8. This is what you're doing on the 3 sets of 10 week. This is what you're doing on the 3 sets of 8 week, right? This is what you're doing on the 3 sets of 5 week. So we're getting heavier and heavier, right? So it was kind of like a little bit of powerlifting type of thing, like work your way down, and you'd work through those muscle groups. And that's what we were doing. And so we were constantly improving. Like he had, back then it was like the iron on, like shiny stuff. It wasn't even screen printed, but he had like Weight Club, like Carrollton Athletics, we were the Trojans. So it was like Trojan Weight Club or something like that. And like once you hit 200 and like say 1 rep max bench, you got a 200. And he did it every 25 pounds. So once you hit 225, so we were always like trying to get the number on our side of our shirt so we could wear it around, like I bench 200 pounds, I bench 225, and he did the same with leg stuff. So he had like a 500-pound club, a 550, a 600, 650, on shorts, and where he had the number. And so for guys who are like, raging testosterone at 16, it was a big motivator to like be in the weight room improving yourself all the time.
So it sounds like a lot of those lists were based around compound movements, which I know a lot of runners um, benefit from. These compound movements, focusing on a lot of strength and power. Because I mean, you don't necessarily need to be doing a ton of high volume because you're running so much, right? So, do you still keep those compound movements in your strength and mobility workouts, or how do you kind of go about your strength nowadays?
It's more circuit like dumbbell work. So upper body, lower body, core. So I do something called it's on Ultrarunning Magazine's YouTube channel. If you look up Jeff Browning Tough 21, it's 21 minutes, 45 seconds on, 15 seconds to switch, and you're using dumbbells and you're doing upper body. Say you're doing like, like deadlift, upright row press, right, with dumbbells, right? So you're doing multiple movements, but and you're really focusing on movement and engagement, and that's why it's timed. So you don't have to really think about counting. You just have to think about movement patterns, like did I squeeze my glutes at the top of the movement? Did I tuck my hips under me? Did I engage my core? Right? Did I drive my shoulders back to my ears and pinch my shoulder blades? So we're thinking about really good movement patterns, and are my feet lined up? Are my big toes pointed straight ahead like parallel like headlights? Or because you don't want to be developing imbalances. So really thinking about like proper form and movement patterns in these movements. And so that's kind of where I kind of evolved, and that came really out of P90X years. If you've ever done a P90X workout, anybody, the old P90X Beachbody stuff, those DVDs, I had those in the early days, and I tried to do the early P90X, P90X2, P90X3. But I really found that like I can't go. I'm trying to run. I need to run first as far as time. If I look at my week, like if I got to carve out this time to train, I need it to be very time efficient to do strength training. And so that's where I developed, based off P90X3, I developed this Tough 21 workout. Was like, 21 minutes, I can spend way more than 21 minutes like messing around on Facebook, or social media. So like I can carve time for 21 minutes. It started out as a 15-minute workout and evolved into a 21-minute workout. But initially I was like, I just got to get 15 minutes in, and so I did these 15-minute workouts like 3 days a week, and it was full body. So I knew once I did it, even if I missed a couple days, I'm okay, and then I get back on it and I do a full body, right? So I wouldn't have to think about like, oh, I only got lower body. Oh man, I haven't done upper body for like a week because I got busy. I knew I got my whole, I touched from top of the head to the soles of my feet. And so that's where that came from, but it's evolved over the years. So now it was just one weight, right? Like just figure out what works for you, pick a weight, made it really easy to coach too, because people could do it at home and you just need one dumbbell or one set of dumbbells. But as I've evolved it, I've actually started to do, I've read the book. If you're into strength training, you should read the book. And you're an endurance athlete, you should read the book, Maximum Overload for Cyclists by Jacques Devore.
Okay,
Great
I'll
book
check it
about
out.
strength training and endurance sports. And so I read his book, and then I evolved my kind of model to like the first day of the week. So I did his workouts, but it's still an hour workout. I was like, man, most people are not going to carve out an hour. If you're coaching them and they got a job and they got kids and they're trying to do ultras and they're trying to train for ultras, they can't work out an hour. Maybe they can in the off season, but they can't in the main season. So I needed to come up with something. So what I did was like kind of evolve the Tough 21 workout into just instructing people to like on the first day of the week or early in the week, right after your long runs, because there's research to back up that if we do some heavier strength training, especially like powerlifting type sets, where it's increasing weight every set, decreasing reps. Okay. Increasing weight, decreasing reps every set. So for 3 sets, say. So for example, 12, 8, 6, right? And you're increasing the weights. What that does is it does some reset. If you're like sore and kind of range of motion is kind of limited because you're tight after a long run weekend and a big volume block over the weekend, you come back on Monday, say, and do a strength training workout, and you do your heaviest day that day. That helps reset everything. That also works on powerlifting. So, because what we want is we don't want to gain weight. We want to have power. So we want to be at a percentage of our max. What can we sustain at a percentage of our max? So it doesn't, who cares about a 1 rep max? It's how much of that 1 rep max we can sustain for a long period of time, that power output. So that's where the powerlifting sets come in. But you can't really handle, when you're endurance training, you can't handle powerlifting sets like every workout. But once a week, strategically timed at the beginning of the week, is where I kind of look at my heaviest day is like early in the week, like right after my long runs. So that for me, I long run on Friday, Saturday, sometimes just Friday. So usually Sunday or Monday is when I have a pretty decent time in the gym where I'm doing descending reps, increasing weight. And then the other 2 workouts are more tough 21 style, where it's one weight, the weight I start with as the warm-up weight on earlier in the week, that set of 12, say. And then I'm just doing range of motion mobility work under a load. So I'm still getting a strength benefit. I'm still getting a range of motion benefit because I'm working on full range of motion, full body, core, everything included. And then I just do that. I try to hit that 2 other days a week. So I'm in the gym 3 days a week now, pretty consistently. Unless I'm gonna have travel coming on and stuff like that, I'm trying to figure it out. But even like now, we're leaving Friday, Saturday, Sunday to drive to Seattle to visit my wife's family. The 2 hotels I'm staying in, I looked at the gym when I was booking it on Expedia because I'm like, well, I'm not gonna run that much while I'm driving, so I'm gonna make sure I get in the weight room while I'm on the road. So I'm prioritizing strength. And then I also do mobility in the gym. The first 10 minutes, I'm like doing like yoga type stretching and like knees over toes guy work and all that kind of stuff. It's like deep forward lunges and like opening everything up and really working on, mobility before I strength train. So I kind of team those days up. So that kind of gives you kind of an idea of what I do now.
Gotcha. No, that makes a lot of sense. One thing that I have been reading, watching videos on, asking a lot of questions about, and I don't know if there's a right or wrong way to do it or a right or wrong approach to it, but basically in a given week, you're going to have, for the most part, and you tell me if I'm wrong, but one like tempo type workout where you're doing, like repeats, one like, we'll call it a speed workout, and then one long run, and then, a decent amount of just like, easy aerobic base building type workouts. Does that sound pretty standard?
That's really the bread and butter of endurance training right there.
Okay. So along with that, when would be the right times, or the proper times to incorporate these strength training workouts? Let's say Tuesday is your speed workout and Saturday is your long run. That's just kind of how my schedule, Tuesday or Wednesday being the speed workout, and then Saturday being the long run. How would you program like that strength training, but also like recovery in there too? Because I've also heard people who do like a heavy strength workout like the day after their long run or their speed day, or I would love to get your opinion on this.
So what I would say is, ideally, I would put your strength day on Sunday. So like if your long runs on Saturday, I'd want you coming back and doing some weight work on Sunday or Monday, one or the other. Now, some people are going to be okay the day right after a long run and to get in the weight room, and some people are going to be still really kind of beat up, depending on your history in the sport. So it might need to be moved to Monday. If that was the case, then we've got to move your speed work to Wednesday, right? Because it needs to be 48 hours after that heavier strength. You can't do it the next day. You're going to have heavy legs. So it's going to be worthless workout. So it's got to be timed in the right spot. So it needs to be within a day or two of the long run, ideally. And then you want a day of easy running before you do your speed work, right? So Sunday, for most people, I would say you're going to have to do a decent amount of mobility work if you're doing it right after the long run day. But if you're giving it 2 days, I'm most of the time 2 days before I'm doing my heavier day. And then I'm doing my speed like 2 days after that, if that makes sense.
Gotcha.
So it's midweek. And then I've got easy running until I do my long run again.
Gotcha. Okay. So say theoretically you go Monday would be probably like an easy run, and then like the more powerlifting, heaviest workout of the week. Tuesday, maybe some mobility, another easy run. Wednesday, that speed work. Thursday, easy run.
Yeah, easy run, hill work, or like somewhere in there. I would like Thursday for ultra running. Most people are doing mountainous or hilly type of trail running. So getting some hills midweek somewhere as more of not sometimes you might look at it as a quality day. So maybe that's a Friday. So it's a Wednesday, Friday scenario, like in the situation we're talking about, or a Tuesday speed work. If you did strength on Sunday, Tuesday speed work, Wednesday might be an easy shakeout, Thursday might be hills. Or in the other scenario, it'd be Wednesday speed work, Friday hills. And then specificity on the long run for whatever events coming up.
Yeah. So let's say, for example, you're doing that speed work on Wednesday, then that Saturday, you also might have some like tempo running built in there. So, at least when I was in marathon prep, it would be like, yeah, you're going to throw in like the last 5 miles are going to be at like your goal marathon pace. I know it's different for like regular marathons versus ultras, but like, let's say you're adding in some tempo on that long run on Saturday. Would it still be beneficial to do hills on Thursday or Friday, or do you want to like kind of keep those fresh legs going into that Saturday run?
In an ideal scenario, you kind of want you don't. I kind of like easy, flatter running in between the hill days if possible, but it isn't totally necessary. I think one of the things that we do get like vert centric in ultra running, like where we focus on just hills. I need to go do more hills. I need to go more. Whereas the flat running really helps you with that like kind of quick cadence metronome, like road running style of like wiring that in, because like a lot of times you'll get feedback from, especially as a coach, you'll get feedback from runners who would be like, yeah, I was great on the hills, but there was a 5K section on dirt road and oh man, it hurt so bad, because they're just not used to like that just like finding that zone, that quick flow of like just turnover, right? So I think you need to practice all those disciplines. And I think one thing that Jason Koop really illustrates is that there's 4 distinct disciplines in ultra running. There's power hiking, there's uphill running, downhill running, and flat running. They're all distinct enough physiologies that we need to train all 4 of them and not like discount any of them. So I think you still need hills. But where they fit isn't as important as the effort. So like if it's right the day after speed work, well, then that's going to be more of a power hike focus on the uphills, right? You're not going to be hammering uphills because you're going to hover into like, an RPE that's more steady state, zone 3 type heart rate. And you don't really want to do that the day after a hard workout. You want to be completely aerobic. So timing what workouts afterwards, it depends on how disciplined you are in your pace and your effort level, training by RPE. So I think, I think specificity for the hill work, what we're usually doing is hill work, if you're doing it on your long run, is going to be some speed work in disguise. Unless you're hiking every single hill and keeping yourself aerobic, most people are trying to run some of the hills, either work on transitions or something like that, that's something specific to the race you're going to be doing. And you're by nature going to hover into that kind of zone 3 heart rate during that workout. So we kind of have to always look at especially if it's trail running and mountain running, we always have to look at the long run day as kind of a quality day too. So we have to keep that in mind in perspective. Like, okay, we had a Wednesday speed work. Well, Saturday is going to be a kind of a speed work too, even though it's speed work in disguise. But you are working those systems.
Gotcha. So another thing that I really want to touch on is kind of your very, far away model tactic to like nutrition in ultra running. And so I've had Zach Bitter on the show, I've had Mike McKnight on the show, and now I know I'm very grateful to have you on the show here
I'm
today.
responsible. Zach helped me, and then I helped Mike.
Yes,
So there's a trickle down in that relationship.
there is. I loved hearing the episode that you guys did, or I think it was like couple episodes you guys did together, kind of just going back and forth on a bunch of different things. And it's just really interesting to get your guys' perspective on like the OFM, the oxidative fat metabolism. And for anybody who doesn't know what that is, I would love for you to touch a little bit on that and kind of just really explain, like for people who don't know what I'm talking about, like kind of explain your approach to nutrition in ultra running and how it's kind of like on the other side of the spectrum in terms of like what traditional research and studies mainstream nutrition advice for ultra running.
Well, I think that there's a lot of dogma in mainstream everything, not just
Right.
nutrition. So one of the things I think that's important to understand, I'm coming at this from, well, so in my 20s, I'll give you a little background history. In my 20s, I was a vegetarian for 7 years. My wife and I didn't really work with me. I'd come from that strength training, farm, meat eating, hunting background. And then I tried to be a vegetarian in my 20s, and I lost muscle mass. I saw my body type change. Like it just, I didn't thrive on it. I didn't have good health outcomes. Neither did my wife. And then our youngest, our oldest child, who's 21 now. When he was born, the first 18 months of his life, he was a vegetarian. We raised him as a vegetarian. I feel guilty about that still. And but he was not thriving. He was like 10th percentile size and weight, and he just didn't look good. He had some early decay in his teeth, in his baby teeth, really fast decay. And we started working with a naturopath that was part of the Western Price Foundation, westonaprice.org, which was like kind of ancestral eating, raw milk,
Yep.
soak your
My
legumes.
my mom's all in the Weston A. Price stuff. Yep.
Okay, yeah. So it's like Nourishing Traditions, Sally Fallon's book. And we got hold of that in like 2004. And when he's about 18 months old, and we switched our diet to like, grass-fed meats and free-range chicken and wild caught fish, and we brought meat back in, and then we still were doing grains, but we were like, soaking our legumes and soaking rice, and to get rid of, break down phytic acid and all that kind of stuff to make it more absorbable. And we were following that kind of Nourishing Traditions model. And we did that for about 12 or 13 years. And we did well on it because we were doing raw milk, raw cheese, raw dairy, cultured dairy. And we did fine on it. But by the time I hit my 40s, mid 40s, I was having some health issues. And I couldn't figure it out, and I knew it had to be something that with diet. And that's when I made the kind of tighten the screws in the end of 2015 season. I was talking about retiring and not racing hard anymore because I was just getting beat up, and I just wasn't recovering like I used to. And that's when I actually called Zach. He was the first person I called. We had we were both sponsored by Ultra, and we had like run together a few times when we were at like Outdoor Retailer back when it was in Salt Lake City. And we had chatted about diet quite a bit because I was already geek about diet, but I was in this like Weston A. Price kind of bubble, and I wasn't in this like kind of more paleo style. And we found out over the years by just tinkering that my wife was sensitive to grains and like simpler flour based stuff. So she was eating, even if it was like, spelt pasta, she was still if she had too many meals in a row, she'd get migraines. And so we found that she was sensitive, like, kind of sensitive to like more simple carbs. And so we had already been kind of like thinking about that. And then I was an endurance athlete, and I was like not willing to get my, my rice and pasta and stuff. And so fast forward into 2015, I'm like desperate. I've spent about a week of research, digging into like paleo and keto circles. I had candida kind of issue going on in my GI tract, and I was having some flare-ups, and I was rashes and like weird stuff, skin rashes, and just didn't feel well. And I looked inflamed. I just didn't look good. Now, you look in the mirror and you're like, dude, I did not look good. And so I kind of, pushed away from that research in a week and told my wife, I think we need to kind of go paleo keto. And she's like, well, I have 2 cookbooks, and she'd been wanting to try it for a while because of that sensitivity to like simpler carbs. And so, she liked the idea of cutting out grains and sugar in our everyday diet. And so we immediately right there on the spot, we did it. I called Zach. I started chatting with him. He put me in contact with Peter Defty at vespapower.com. And Peter really Zach helped me in the early days, and then Peter kind of took over as a mentor and really helped me fine tune this idea of OFM, optimized fat metabolism. And that is tapping into this kind of ancestral eating pattern of hey, there were times in our seasonal eating patterns that we were really no carbs or hardly any carbs, and we were just on animal fats and proteins, right? And so this kind of ketogenic idea of going kind of keto, low carb, very low carb, and then getting all your macros from protein and fat. And so I kind of did the reset where you do a keto reset for a month. I was in the process of training. I was 7 weeks out when I started the shift. I was 7 weeks out from Hurt 100 in January of 2016. So I started in December of 2015. And I just went hardcore. I went keto for a month. And then I started bringing back strategic carbs from paleo sources like fruit, a little bit of sweet potatoes, and then veggies were kind of a baseline, and then meat. And I started doing that and trying to avoid seed oils. I kind of got hold of Primal Blueprint as well at the same time. I started reading Mark Sisson's stuff and marksdailyapple.com, and really started kind of following, after I did that initial keto reset, I really started following Primal Blueprint as kind of a general lifestyle diet approach. No grains, no sugar, and avoiding seed oils. And so, cooking with saturated fats, lard, tallow, butter, ghee, coconut oil, stuff like that. Using avocado oil and olive oil strategically and dressings, homemade dressings and bases, but not really cooking high heat with it. All those kind of things. So not messing with those monounsaturated fats, but really cooking with saturated fats. I read the book Big Fat Surprise at that time by Nina Tolschlitz. Great book on all the research and the dogma behind cholesterol and saturated fat causing heart disease. And that kind of got me out of that dogma, because I'd taken some nutrition classes in college, was almost a nutrition major, decided on graphic design and fine art, but had taken for about a year and a half had been in kind of a nutrition major kind of scenario. And so I took a lot of nutrition classes in college, and the dogma was all vegetarian, carbs, whole grains, right? Minimizing meat, but having a small portion on your plate. And I flipped that on its head, and I started doing this kind of Primal Blueprint. And all of a sudden, man, I got lean. I lost weight. I kind of was inflamed. I had put on extra pounds. I couldn't quite get down to race weight anymore in my 40s, mid 40s. All of a sudden I was lean. I was muscular. I was had all this energy. I wasn't constantly hungry and angry at the same time, because you're hungry. So all of a sudden, all those cravings went away for sugar, because I kind of minimized sugar in my everyday diet. And I was a 90. Once I kind of settled in, I was really strict for about a year. And then I kind of settled into more of a 90-10, 80-20 rule, where it's yeah, let it loose for a meal or two a week. It's okay. You don't have to be crazy. But I was on the straight and narrow 90% of the time, right? Most of my meals. And what I saw was, one, when you restrict carbohydrate for 4 weeks, and you have this metabolic pathway to burn onboard fat. Now, anytime that you have some kind of food come in that has a glucose load on the system. So let's say any carbohydrate, whether that's a Snickers bar on one end of the spectrum or a vegetable on the other end of the spectrum. They're both carbohydrate to the liver and the bloodstream, because the liver converts it into glucose into the bloodstream, and it's a glucose load on the bloodstream. Now, fruit with fiber in it, not juiced, but fruit with fiber in it, vegetables, that's going to be 2, 3, 4 tablespoons of glucose to your bloodstream. Your homeostasis is 1 teaspoon in the bloodstream. So it's always trying to get back to homeostasis by the pancreas kicking out insulin and knocking the blood sugar back down to homeostasis. And all this I was learning when I first made this shift. I was learning all about teaspoon of glucose. I'd never heard that in my nutrition classes, that's your homeostasis. And so, for example, a whole wheat bagel is like 8 to 10 teaspoons to your bloodstream. So you're dumping all, and you think about the average American diet, bagel for breakfast or a toast with eggs, and then like a sandwich at lunch with chips, or a pasta salad, or then pasta for dinner. I mean, you just threw like 60 teaspoons of glucose into your bloodstream, and your homeostasis is 1. So you have all this circulating glucose, and whenever there's circulating glucose, and especially a high teaspoon dump into your bloodstream, the body says, store fat in the cell. And it's from our seasonal eating when it was a time, like we in most latitudes, especially in North America, most latitudes was, maybe a 2 to 3 month window where there were things ripen in season, and we had a lot of carbs to eat, and then they were gone, and then we had to go back to fats and proteins, animal fats and proteins, for 9 months of the year. So we always ate seasonally, and we always went into a ketogenic phase, and then we went in a high protein phase, and then we went into a high carb phase. But that was always before winter. It was kind of a seasonal mechanism of safety for us, because we put on weight, signal to the body, hey, we have all these carbs right now in season. Let's put on 20 pounds. Now we're going to tap into that fat in the winter, because now the carbs aren't there anymore. And now all of a sudden that metabolic pathway clicks over from restricting carbohydrate out of necessity. There weren't any carbohydrate, right? And then we tap into it. We lose weight. We get leaner, more muscular. And then we go through that cycle again the next year. So that made sense to me from our ancestral perspective. And so the OFM model is really looking at, instead of a macro level, we're looking at on a micro level of a week of training. So we're after that initial reset phase, because it takes about 4 weeks to open up that metabolic pathway to burn on board fat by restricting carbohydrate. It takes a good 10 days before it even is hardly even open. So we have to restrict carbohydrates. When does anybody ever restrict carbohydrates more than 10 days? Hardly ever, especially in our mainstream dogma. So you're always being pushed as an endurance athlete. You need carbs, top off your glycogen. Well, it doesn't take much to top off glycogen. It's only 2,000 calories. It's not very much, but our fat stores are gigantic. And so we have, a person with 7% body fat has more than, 40,000 onboard fat calories, more than enough to run 100 miles, as Mike McKnight has proven. That you can run it without calories. Now, it isn't ideal for performance, because carbs have their place. And I want to make sure I emphasize that carbs have their place, but the type of carb matters. And so going back to this idea of this restricting carbohydrate to get that metabolic pathway open, it opens up at about 4 weeks, but it gets really efficient at about 8 to 12 weeks, meaning it keeps opening up. It opens up more and more and more. So you burn more grams of onboard fat per minute than you did, say, at 4 weeks, that you will at 8 weeks. So really, you have to kind of go through this kind of phase of 4 weeks strict keto, back off on volume, really easy running. You're going to be flat. And then all of a sudden, you're going to have really consistent energy. You're going to feel like you could skip a meal and not notice it, even though you shouldn't, but you'll feel like that. And you're starting to tap into onboard fat. Well, you continue to restrict carbohydrates in phase 2 after that 4 weeks for another 6 weeks. So that's 10 weeks total, 4 weeks in the initial keto reset phase, and then another 6 weeks. And that 6-week window, you're bringing back strategic carbohydrates from paleo, kind of primal blueprint sources, right? And if you're going to put a name around the diet and what the food list looks like, it's like fruits and starches like potatoes, sweet potatoes. You're putting those in strategically after workouts, or before a hard workout, a little bit of fruit 2 hours before a hard workout, and you'll have some pop. And so you're topping glycogen off, and you're prioritizing carbohydrates from real sources, paleo sources, in those like windows after workouts when you need to top glycogen back off. And then you're focusing on, instead of moderate protein, you're upping your protein after those reset phases, because that helps with recovery. And the more research that comes out on protein, especially animal protein, we see, the recommendations have gone from like 0.8 to 1 gram per pound of body weight to like 1.2 to 1.3 grams per pound of body weight, which is what I hit on a daily basis. So I weigh 145 pounds. I'm shooting for 160 plus of protein every day. I just track my macros of protein, and then I eat fruit and I eat starches and I eat some veggies, and that's it. And there's small portions on my plate. I still eat them, but I focus on my animal protein every day and my protein intake. So that's coming from like animal sources, eggs, everything from, herbivore, fowl, fish, eggs, raw dairy, and that's where it's all, most of my protein's coming from. Some whey occasionally, especially for convenience factor at times, or like right after a workout with like frozen fruit, mixing in a smoothie, that kind of stuff. But the key here is like strategic carbohydrate. That's really what OFM is, strategic carbs, meaning we're timing them around when our uptake's going to be good. We're not going to put it on as fat. Remember, if you have too many carbohydrates, you're signaling store fat in the cell. We want to top off glycogen and not store fat. We just want to utilize fat, right? And so, and then we want to leverage recovery with high protein. So that's really where we evolve to as we do this reset, this kind of strategic carbs. And then the ongoing is like upping protein and finding your sweet spot of like how much protein every day and what foods you like within that food umbrella or food list that we want to kind of focus on. And so that's why, Zach and I and Mike, we trade notes sometimes, and we're all very similar in how we do it. We just have some foods we like better than others, and then some of our go-to foods. I might use bananas more than Mike. Mike probably hardly ever has a banana. He mainly has berries, and he has a lot of raw milk. I have limited access to raw milk, so I don't have I used to live where he is, and he has great resource, and I don't have as good a resource. So I can get it, but like sometimes I have to go a week without it. And I'll have it for 2 weeks, and then I'll have a week off and that kind of stuff. And so I just have to kind of manage it that way. But that's really, if that makes sense, that's kind of the overview of OFM.
No, thank you for unpacking that. That was, I've learned a ton about that right there. I'm curious. So a lot of directions I could take that, a lot of questions I could go with that, but
I know it was pretty deep. Sorry, dude. That was pretty detailed.
No, I'm so glad you did that too, because it was kind of like as you were talking, I would have these questions in my head and you kind of just kept building off of that. So I thought that was a very, really, really good high level overview of what OFM is. I definitely understand it a lot more. And I hope for everyone listening that they understand that too. To go back to like what you originally were saying there, kind of like that keto reset of like just learning to tap into your fat stores and use that as energy. And then moving into that second phase, and then ultimately like that third phase where you're starting to introduce some more strategic carbohydrates. That keto reset phase, and context is king in everything, but who would benefit most from that like reset? Is it just the ultra endurance athlete? Is it like somebody who's trying to run like a PR in just the marathon? Is it the everyday individual? Like who's going to benefit from that like reset?
I think everyone, because hardly anyone's done it, because we aren't forced to eat seasonally anymore, right? For the last 80 years, we've just been eating like it's everything's ripened in season year round. So our body's always like store fat in the cell, store fat in the cell, store fat in the cell. You're constantly signaling store fat in the cell. And we've even seen this in like endurance sports where someone gets older and they've been eating this high carb approach their whole life, which I did for 15 years of my endurance career, was high carb. It was, I bought into the dogma. But what I found is what happens, and you'll see this with like, say, Dr. Tim Noakes, he got type 2 diabetes, right? when he was older, and he was thin. Like at some point, it catches up to you. It's gonna catch up to you. I know, and I know that, like, I know people don't like to hear that, but when you're signaling this constant, like, tons of glucose circulating in the bloodstream, at some point that there is you have to pay the piper for that. Now, some people are more metabolically healthy from a base perspective, meaning they're going to be able to get by a lot longer. And some people might not be. And so then that might catch up in their 40s, might catch up in their 50s, might catch up in their 60s, maybe their 70s. But like me, it started to catch up in my mid 40s. Something wasn't right. And I was in tune enough with my body from playing with diet over the years and trying different things that I knew it wasn't, just like in the vegetarian days, I knew something wasn't quite right, you know? And then I was like, okay, well, I'll tweak to this. And then I was like, oh, I figured it out. And then 12 years later or 13 years later, I'm like, yeah, it's not quite right. And so tighten the screws a little more. And so I would encourage people just to experiment with what they do, try new things, be open to like trying it, because I think it's going to help. What it's going to do is make you a better fat burner. And what we found in our testing, in our lab testing, is that it gets really, because I've been doing it now 8 years, and it gets more and more efficient. When in the early days when I was doing some lab testing on stuff, and let's say I was burning, 1.3 grams of fat per minute. And my crossover point, like the crossover point in a test when you're looking at fuel substrates, would be like when you're running aerobic zones, you're mainly burning fat, really, really high, hardly any carbohydrate, hardly any glucose. And then at some point they start to converge as you get a harder effort, and you hit a crossover point. Now, that was traditionally accepted at about 55 to 65% of VO2 max. The crossover point on everybody happens that way. Now, I was in a lab at Utah State, and my crossover point is like 92% of VO2 max. So that means I can run on primarily fat stores and my onboard fat stores at over 90% of my VO2 max.
And for context, for somebody listening, where is, like, if they're looking at more of like a lot of runners, they'll look at their heart rate, right? So like, about where is your like heart rate crossover point where you start to burn carbs?
Mine's like in the upper 150s.
Okay.
So
that's pretty high.
Way lower. Yes,
Oh, okay.
That would be way lower. So it'd be more like in the 130s, 140s.
Oh, wow.
So what that tells us is that we don't really understand fat metabolism yet, because all the studies that have been done on fat metabolism, and I applaud the people that have tried it out there, right? But they still don't have it. They haven't figured out. They aren't doing OFM, that's for sure, because it's all been on keto. Like, we are not keto. Mike and I and Zach, we're not. We use keto as a tool, right? But occasionally, but we're not training in our big volume block. We're having 150, 170, 200 grams of carbs a day from those paleo sources, but we're still having a decent amount of carbs. We're not having under 50 grams keto style, and we're eating a ton of protein, which also, when you have excess protein in the system, any excess protein gets converted through gluconeogenesis to glucose to top off glycogen. So you're also getting a glycogen benefit from a high protein approach. So we all have evolved to in our big training, high protein strategic carbs around effort and volume. So that way we're topping off glycogen. We're not messing with bone density, because the keto studies show that, like, if you're really low carb, which means keto means moderate protein too, not high protein. So all those things, being equal, then they're seeing like, oh, it's affecting your bone density a little bit at a bad, it's not a good thing. And so, like, ketogenic needs to be like only used strategically, like on a rest day, or when you don't need those carbs. So carbs still have a place. We're just using them in a strategic fashion. So we're not having all this circulating blood glucose all the time, which then keeps us lean, keeps us tapping into fat at a high level. And so, like, when you look at like some of the outliers, like myself and like Pete Mortimer and probably Zach, I haven't seen his lab numbers or anything, but Pete and I have been in the lab at the same time, and we both burn over 2 grams a minute at our peak fat oxidation rate, right? And previously that was the dogma. So in a physiology setting in a university, that was kind of, that ceiling was about 1 gram per minute. We're doubling that by manipulating our lifestyle diet. So that, and originally we were talking about that crossover point at 55 to 65% of VO2 max. We actually are pushing that out about 20 points for most of us that are fat adapted athletes. We're pushing, Nick Curry would be another example, right? We push that crossover point way out. So that means we're burning way more higher rate of fat for longer at a higher heart rate, at a higher output, which then has application in a marathon, right? Because you're going to run a marathon at 80 something percent VO2 max, right?
Yep.
And if I can burn to 91% of my VO2 max, that means when I'm at 87, I'm burning I'm burning primarily fat. I hardly need any calories, and I'm not going to have any GI stress. I just have to worry about hydration and electrolyte balance and a little bit of light carb calories. Now, you still need simple carbs on long runs and races. I want to make sure I emphasize that, because I don't want to send anybody down the path where it's like, oh, I can only eat fat and protein on long runs. Don't do that. You'll just get GI stress. It's too complex. You still need simple carbs. You need simple carbs because a little bit of glucose lights the wick for us to tap into that base of fat. So, and it's how pyruvate attaches to mitochondria. It needs a little bit of glucose to light that fat metabolism. So we really want to, think about it like a candle. Like the candle is the base of it is your fat storage, and the wick is your glucose metabolism. You need to light the wick to tap into that big base of energy. So we need a little light glucose. That's why like IV dripping liquid calories of like, Tailwind, Scratch, Goo Octane, something like that with some electrolytes, and then just make sure you get enough electrolytes, right, per liter drink rate. And those are kind of key pieces to like, and that's a whole nother conversation, but of race nutrition. But
Sure. So for your typical runs, like, are you doing these fasted? Because if you see a lot of these, I get back and forth because I see these like sports dietitians, these running dietitian people on Instagram, and it's like, yeah, go eat graham crackers or freaking white bread and jelly, things like that.
Go dump 10 teaspoons of glucose.
Right, because they're like, oh, it's gonna help you facilitate recovery after. And I'm just like, well, I hear guys like you and Zach and Mike and people who like, you run for hours, like, running fasted, and you don't have any of that processed junk, right? So what does that look like? Are they right? Like, is that dumping all that glucose into my bloodstream, is that gonna help me recover? Is that gonna enhance my performance? Like, what's your
doesn't
approach?
take that much carbohydrate to top off glycogen. Remember, you only have like 2 to 2,500 calories of glycogen storage, right? It's our fight or flight fuel to go really hard, fast, right? To get away from a predator. Like, so yes, we do need it. It is something that we need to be able to like keep topped off, but you don't need white bread and a pile of pasta to top it off. Like a little tiny amount, like a couple pieces of fruit will top it off. It's in a little raw honey, and a little excess protein, and which won't affect your blood sugar, right? That's another thing with the gluconeogenesis, from excess protein getting converted to glucose, it doesn't affect your blood sugar. You're not going to get a blood sugar spike. So then it doesn't say store fat in the cell. You stay lean. So when they say that, they haven't looked at the more recent research. Maybe they're coming out of a dogma of a nutrition school, I don't know, that's still teaching an older curriculum. But if you look at like the research on protein, we see like you could have way more than 1.2 to 1.3 grams per pound of body weight and never affect your blood numbers, never affect your kidneys, never affect your liver, never affect any of those numbers. We only see increase in recovery benefit from protein, not carbs. The true recovery tool is protein. And I think that's what we've seen all these endurance athletes like myself and Mike and Zach, who are have been playing around with this and using ourselves as an N=1 experiment. We found that we've all evolved to have more protein in our diet. So more carnivore paleo, right? So it's like high protein and then strategic carbohydrate use around those workouts. But I focus on protein every single day. And I think the research definitely backs it up. And if you want to go listen to a Coopcast, Dr. Antonio, I can't remember his last name. It's probably from about 6-8 weeks ago. And he goes into, he's one of the premier researchers, 30 years of doing supplements and then protein research and showing that, like, hey, anybody who's giving you a saying that, like, or what he was saying is like, you need to focus on protein as an athlete and then let all the other macros fall where they may. But you focus on your protein intake every day, hit your numbers.
I was listening to something from Dr. Peter Attia recently talking about protein timing, just because I've been experimenting with this a lot lately. Like, I've only been eating about like 2 to 3 meals a day, which has been great from like a lifestyle standpoint, but it is more difficult to get in like the protein goal. Like I'm 190 pounds. So like I'm trying to get in, 190 to 200 grams, at least per day. And that's really tough to get in with just 2 to 3 meals. And then also I heard Peter Attia talking about, like, if you're having more than 50 grams of protein at one time, you're not really getting the most benefit out of it. So is there benefit to having more meals throughout the day? And then like, protein timing?
Well, I would say meals for an endurance athlete, every 3 to 5 hours, have some food, have a meal, but don't snack in between. You need to like let the body like eat and let it burn, right? A lot of people will snack all day, chronic snackers, really bad for your GI tract. It's hard on your it's hard. If anybody wants to look it up, they can look it up, like migrating motor complex, MMC. Some of this research came out of Colorado State. But it's looking at like that growling mechanism that we have, that we always like say, oh, I'm hungry. It's actually not hunger. It's actually just, it's contractions in your GI tract after you haven't put any food. Even a couple little tiny few peanuts will stop it. Because as soon as there's food, solid food in digestion, this isn't counting liquid, but it's counting digestion, like solid food. When we put food into digestion, at about depending on the food and how complex it was, somewhere in the 2 to 4 hour window, we start to get this growling mechanism kick back in. That is actually contractions cleaning out excess waste in your GI tract. Now, if you put food back into digestion, it's just like a 4-alarm fire, all hands on deck, back to digestion, right? Mm-hmm. So we want to let that migrating motor complex happen at least once a day, but hopefully a couple times a day. Hopefully you'd go more than 3 hours without a meal every once in a while. And so that's why I coach athletes, don't snack, eat, but sit down and eat. Don't like just like eat a small bit of a little thing real quick, like eat a meal, like focus on your protein. So for me, I'm usually having 4 servings of protein a day. I try to hit 50 to 60 grams, 40 to 60 grams per serving, somewhere in that window. Now there's a lot of like Peter Attia says 50 grams. There's several people out there saying somewhere in that 50 to 70 range is about your max, depending on the individual. So, I'm sure it's kind of a sliding scale depending on size and how much muscle you have and health of your GI gut biome and everything else. I'm sure there's all those are factors, but I would say, like, if we're shooting for those numbers, then you're going to hit them, So I know if I hit 50 grams, I'm going to hit 150 grams as a baseline if I have 3 meals, right? And I'm usually having 4. So I'm usually having like one other kind of smaller meal to get that protein number up over 160 for me personally, right? I weigh 145. So I'm shooting for 160 plus a day.
Cool. So I know that you also block out your lunchtime. That's kind of like your run time, right? Throughout the day. So are you getting a meal in before that run, or are you doing that fasted?
No, I only fast like long run mornings. So because I run in the morning. So I usually fast on race day. and on long run days. And that's more for just like, don't have to worry about GI stuff. And then I use simple carbs during the run. So I'm not like fasting on the runs. I'm just going into the workout fasted.
Sure.
Right. So I'm still using, I use Tailwind. So I'm using Tailwind as an IV drip of calories in one bottle and electrolytes mixed in, extra electrolytes, extra salt, and then water in the other. But and then some gels and other stuff here and there. Um, uh, but no, I'm usually prioritizing eating in the morning. So like this morning, I had 4 eggs for breakfast and bulletproof coffee, and then
Okay, so you're getting in about how many grams of protein with that?
that's probably 25 that I had this morning. Now sometimes I'll put cheese on that. Sometimes I'll add meat, so that'll get me up over in that 30 to 40 range. And then I'm trying to eat about 60 grams of protein, 60 to 70 grams of protein at lunch. So after my lunch workout, um, and some carbs. So I'm usually having like fruit with lunch or something like that. Um, or sometimes I might do like a smoothie, like fruit smoothie with about 40 grams of protein, and then like an hour later eating actually a like real protein meal, like meat and maybe a salad or something. Um, and so that's going to be a pretty big amount. Usually one of those meals out of the, if there's 3 that are spaced, and then one of those are kind of a roving protein focused meal to get that bump in protein, but also just because sometimes when you're in heavy training blocks, I'm hungry. And so I'm prioritizing the protein intake before I prioritize anything else.
Gotcha. Okay, so you're not so much worrying about like a fasting window or anything like that. You're more so just focused on fueling for performance.
Yeah, I don't really intermittent fast that often. Occasionally I do, just out of like not necessity, but I just kind of like get busy, or I get up late and I don't make my eggs. And then I'm like, it's 11 o'clock and it's like, oh man, I haven't had any food but coffee. And so I'm kind of like, on those days I just roll with it. And like, so, like usually on those days I'll break my fast before the run with like a banana.
Mm,
So if I get busy, but they're usually like on days where I'm like not, but if I'm doing a speed workout, if I'm doing a long run, I'm focusing on nutrition around those workouts, and I'm prioritizing nutrition. So um, I'm not worrying about like, uh, those other days, the easy days or the rest days, those might be a like intermittent fast day, like once a week, type of
gotcha.
thing.
Okay,
One of my
and so even still, you wouldn't on say like your rest day, right? Even if you do have a hard workout the next day, you're not worrying about topping off your glycogen for the next day. You're doing more of like a lower carb, higher fat day on that recovery day.
Yeah, but I'm still probably having at least a piece of fruit or two, because I prioritize. If I'm going to look at a hierarchy, I'm prioritizing animal proteins first, and those go along with like combined with animal fats because they're going to naturally have some fat in them. And then I'm prioritizing fruit and starch. Fruit first, starch second, meaning potatoes, sweet potatoes, stuff like that, or squash, pumpkin, stuff like that. And then the last thing I would like prioritize, so if you look at the top of the pyramid, would be like vegetables. And I definitely, I mean, I've read um, Paul Saladino's book, Carnivore Code, and I follow him and I followed his evolution. I used to run with him in Bend when he was a vegan back in his 20s, and he was a PA at St. Charles Hospital in Bend. So back when he's a little skinny, scrawny dude, now he's all buff, eating mainly animal based. And it cured his issues, right? Like all his like eczema and all the kind of stuff he was having issues with. Um, but one of the things that's cool about his evolution, I love that he is like not dogmatic, meaning he's hardcore, but he's not like, okay, I wrote a book called Carnivore Code, and now I've kind of realized some other things, like I need to mix some fruit and raw honey in. And now I've kind of evolved it into what he's calling Carnivore 2.0, right? And like, and which makes more appropriate sense from a hunter gatherer perspective. Like, go take away everything you know about nutrition and go eat a piece of kale and then go eat an apple. Like, you're gonna eat the apple if you were like came across it in the wild. You'd be like, what is this bitter stuff, kale, that I'm eating? It's
Yeah.
disgusting. There is a we and eat like, eat fat on a steak. If you take away the whole dogma of like, oh, it might cause a heart attack or something like that we've been told all these years, which is a lie. The research doesn't back it up. That's been debunked by over 70 studies. That then we go, oh my gosh, it tastes so good. And we would have prioritized that in our meals as a hunter-gatherer. We would have said, you know what? It's really easy for me to go with my tribe and my six dudes to go out with like a spear and persistence hunt, because we still had tracking skills, right? We don't have tracking skills anymore, but the tracking skills are the key to persistence hunting, people. If any of you ultra runners are trying to persistence hunt, if you don't know how to track, you won't be able to get it. You won't be able to get the animal. So it's a lost art. But one of the things that's cool about that, if you ever YouTube Kalahari Bushman hunting a kudu, if you've ever seen that YouTube video, it's amazing. It's one dude who is an elder who is like really trained in the tracking part. He puts himself in the head of the kudu. And then he has four wingmen, like two young guys that are fast, and then two other guys. And all they have is like a water bladder in the heat of the day, like on a little pack or a little sling, and a spear. And they track this thing for like 3-4 hours in the heat, and they cull it from the herd. And because he's good at tracking and the runners keep it cold, they keep it cold, so it just gets tired, lays over, and he walks up and spears it. And then he gives thanks for it, sprinkles dirt on it and all this cool stuff. But and understanding the circle of life and all those things, right? He's giving thanks for like the provision. But the cool thing about it is understanding that that's where our ancestors came from. We used to be able to just in 3 or 4 hours leave our hut and go hunt down a giant animal that's going to feed like our whole tribe for the next 4 or 5 days. Because we're going to use nose to tail, we're going to use the whole animal, we're going to use the fat, we're going to use the bone marrow, we're going to use the organs. That's going to keep us from getting scurvy, right? Because it has so high in vitamin C and stuff like that. We would have eaten the whole animal, there would have been nothing wasted, right? Now we look at it and we go, oh, we can only get 200 pounds or 400 pounds from a steer, right? But we're not talking about the bone marrow, the fat, the organ meat, all the other stuff, the hide, like everything else that would be a provision, right? We've lost that art, and we've lost our connection with nature, even that we're part of the circle. We're not top of the food pyramid. We are a top level predator. That's why the eyes are in front of our head and not on the side of our head. But we've lost sight of that kind of fact of where our food used to come from, how we interacted with that food, and now we have a bunch of dogma clouding our brain.
Dude, I've learned so much from you. We could keep going all day. This is such good stuff. I'll have to have you on again, and we'll dive a little bit deeper on this stuff. But I want to be respectful of your time and just want to say thank you for all the insight, the wisdom, and the knowledge that you dropped today. And it's all experiential too. I really appreciate how you've been open to a lot of different things. You've tried a lot of different things. You've used yourself as kind of you said N equals 1, kind of like a human guinea pig. And so my biggest takeaway from you has just been like, just be curious. Try to figure out like what works for you. Don't be like so dogmatic, and don't listen to like what everybody else does. Like, go out and try it and see what works for you, and be open to things. So, before we kind of wrap this up, what is one thing that really excites you about life, about endurance? Just one thing that really excites you right now.
I think the biggest thing for me is just the daily getting out in nature. Like, I still keeps me motivated, it keeps me stoked, keeps my stoke really like high. I still love to train. I still love to get out in the woods. I love helping people. I love the coaching aspect. I love the evolution of coming from a graphic design to, creative background to being this person who has to like look at every person as an individual puzzle piece. How do we improve their life? And we definitely take, from a coaching perspective, we definitely take the kind of a holistic approach to, I know that gets thrown around a lot, but we truly do. We're looking at ourselves as like, where did we come from genetically? Where are we? We came from hunter-gatherers. We're not that far removed from that genetically. So like, if we can tap into a piece of that, we're going to increase longevity. We're going to increase our quality of life. We're going to feel better. We're going to recover faster. Especially for older athletes and aging athletes. I love that. I love helping people like that. It's been really rewarding to like have this career shift in my 40s and going into my 50s now, feeling really good still and recovering fast and just seeing the benefit. And I know there's naysayers, but the funny thing is when you're in the know, you just sit back and chuckle and go, keep up with your dogma. But you know what? Science will eventually catch up. They used to think the earth was flat, and all you flat earthers, you just keep saying your dogma. It's fine. That was the consensus. That was the mainstream, was that the earth was flat. It's actually round. So at least roundish. And so I think that we, in my circle with Zach and Mike, one of the things I think we get here is we get some really, we just keep getting reassurance from our athletes, from people like in their 40s and 50s and 60s who like make the shift. And then they're like, oh my gosh, I feel so much better. Oh my gosh, I recover so much faster. And you're like, yeah, welcome to the club. And so it's really good to be on this side of the things, and we can, we'll debate, but I don't have to get mad. I don't have to argue hard, because I know, we just know that we're following this path of data and how we feel, and it's working. So I would definitely recommend people just be curious. I think that was a good one to end on, man, is be curious.
I love it. My last question I got to ask is a question I ask all my guests on here. This is the Pure Ambition podcast. When you hear those two words, pure ambition, what does that mean to you, and how does it apply to your daily life?
Pure ambition, man, that to me, that says keep trying and don't quit. So I think one thing I've been kind of playing around with right now is just like revisiting some mindset stuff and mindset training. And I think when we have, we want to set goals for ourselves, but we really want to focus on the trajectory. We really want to focus on like the systems we put in place to achieve that goal. Now that goal might change, and that's okay. The goalposts might move, right? We're going to use a football analogy because we both played football. So like the goalposts might move, but that's okay. Because as we go, we might go, you know what? This is more important to me right now. And then your trajectory might move a little bit. But the key is to focus on the systems and the trajectory versus the end goal. Because once we get the end goal, then we move on to something else. It's just part of the process, man. And so is failure. Failure is part of the process. And that's where I think the pure ambition thing's cool, because we don't focus on failure. We analyze it and we move on, and we get back to another system, and we focus on our little tiny steps every day that's going to get us from point A to point B.
I love that. Jeff, thanks so much for everything today. I appreciate it. If people want to check out more of your stuff, where can they find you?
Website, gobroncobilly.com. And it's all my socials, go Bronco Billy, on Instagram, Twitter. Yeah, that's it.
Awesome. I'll have all that stuff linked in the show notes. Make sure to go check that out. Jeff, I appreciate you, man. And we'll have to do this again soon.
Thanks, Dom. Giddy up.
Thank you guys so much for tuning into today's episode. I wanted to give you all a heads up too that I launched a free community on the Upspace app where you can join, ask me questions, connect with like-minded individuals, follow my 4-week running and strength training program that has some dedicated mobility sessions in there as well, so that we can all optimize our health and fitness together. So if you're interested, head over to the App Store, download the Upspace app, and join the Pure Ambition community today. Love you guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.